Good. Well, good morning. Welcome to everybody. Welcome those who are joining us in different parts of the world. When you meet someone for the first time, and some of you will be making new friends during this retreat, it isn't long before you start to talk about yourself and you tell the story that you are. And as you get to know that person better, you may fill in some of the details. We can tell the story of who we are at many different levels. You tell it differently to an immigration officer when you're trying to get through with your visa, or telling somebody who you feel very attracted to but you're not quite sure yet, or telling somebody who you trust very deeply. So the Gospels are cast as a story, not as a philosophical or a theological text, but they tell a story. Indeed, most of the Bible is written as a story. And in all religious traditions, the great scriptures contain stories, because stories can tell us more than the bare facts. I mean, what are the bare facts? We have to select facts anyway, as you do for an immigration officer, in order to communicate the truth. But a story can communicate many subtle levels of meaning, subtle intentions, and can also communicate aspects of yourself that you don't understand, questions that haven't yet been answered. So stories are perhaps much more effective in communicating meaning and truth than just intellectual concepts and so on. So in these talks we are looking at the story of Holy Week and the great events that led up to the death and the resurrection at the heart of Christian faith. And we're looking each day at sort of zooming in on particular details of some of those stories, because each of those details, what makes these scriptures so timeless and so inexhaustible, is the fact that every detail counts. There's no padding really there. And every one of these details over the course of 2,000 years has generated other stories or great works of art or great reflections. So every detail has sort of accumulated meaning, maybe even more meaning than the original writers intended or understood themselves. And we're very happy to have some of our Buddhist friends from the Bere Centre here in West Cork joining us for today. And it's kind of coincidental that you're here, because as I was preparing my thoughts for this session, which is going to be on the part of the story that begins in the Garden of Gethsemane, I was thinking a lot about the Buddha and some parallels to the story of the Buddha. So maybe unconsciously I remembered you were coming, but anyway, that will add to our richness of our discussion, I think, later. So what we're going to do is we'll begin with these reflections, and then we'll take a little break. And during the break, I hope we have the opportunity, as on a good spiritual retreat, to meet other pilgrims and other practitioners and share something of your own journey with them. And then we'll divide up into sort of small groups to have a Lectio period where we can go a little further in a small group into the exploration of this text, of these details, and then we'll end the morning with meditation. So let me begin by reading this account of the night before Jesus died. after the Last Supper, he crossed the Kedron Valley, and when I was in Jerusalem, I discovered that the Kedron Valley is a little dip. It sounds like a great sort of vast geographical extent, but it's just a little dip really in the road. And if you've ever visited the Holy Land, you may have been struck by just how small scale everything is. I mean, Israel is a small little country, and Armageddon, you know, how many films has Arnold Schwarzenegger fought Armageddon in, but it's a little field, about the size of one of these fields on Bere Island. So the imagination has built up these places and these incidents into mighty events or mighty landscapes, but in fact it's all happened in real life on a very small and quite intimate scale. And when I was growing up, before I came to Bere Island, my mother and my aunts, when they gathered together, would tell stories of their childhood on Bere Island. And I absorbed those stories, and when I came here, it was quite a reality shock, because it wasn't quite as romantic as I had imagined, and it was all on a different scale. It was on a real scale. So you have to adapt from the imaginative level of consciousness to the real level. And that's very important for us to consider, because we spend so much of our time in virtual reality, getting our information from the internet, and it's very easy to get out of touch with the physical world, the real world of relationships, the real world of space. Anyway, the Kedron Valley is a small little dip, and it leads you to this garden, walled garden, on the Mount of Olives, called which we know now as Gethsemane. So in this incident, or this description in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, about Jesus praying on this last night as he faces his arrest and trial and death within less than 24 hours. This Gethsemane has embedded itself, impressed itself on the human imagination, particularly the Christian imagination. And I used to get, this good person has died since, but at every feast in the Christian year, I would get a card from them, which was always a card of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. So for Christmas, Easter, special feasts, everything was the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was a pretty graphic image of Jesus sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. So obviously this image had impressed itself very powerfully, or he had bought a huge stock of these cards and wanted to use them up before he died. But it's a crucial link in the chain of meaning that we are undergoing, exploring in this Holy Week. So let me just refresh your memory of the scene. So after the Last Supper, Judas has been identified as the one who will betray him. Judas leaves. Jesus knows what's happening, so he knows the clock is ticking. And then he comes with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. He said to them, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee. Anguish and dismay came over him And he said to them, "My heart is ready to break with grief. Stop here and stay awake with me." He went on a little, fell on his face in prayer, and said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Yet not as I will, but as you will." He came to the disciples and found them asleep. And he said to Peter, "What? Could none of you stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may be spared the test. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to pass me by without my drinking it, your will be done." He came again and found them asleep, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away again, and he prayed the third time, using the same words as before. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Still sleeping? Still taking your ease? The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed to sinful men. Up, let us go forward. The traitor is upon us." So there are slightly different versions of that in the other two Gospels that we'll look at, but that tells pretty much the story. First of all, we see him, as he had done many times regularly in the course of his life, going away to pray to a quiet place. We know that that was just part of his routine. After he had entered into his public life, he had a very busy life with the crowds and with controversy and his healing ministry. But he would interrupt this periodically, just as we interrupt our flow of activity on a daily basis, and he went away to a quiet place to pray, just as we try to take our times of meditation every day, however busy we get. And he goes away alone, but not alone. In one passage in the Gospel, he is described as praying alone in the company of his disciples, which seems a little contradictory. How can you be alone when you're in the company of anybody? And we see this again here. And it's the paradox of solitude and community. And I think anyone who prays deeply, who meditates deeply, breaks through into this paradox, this energizing paradox really, but challenging paradox of the relationship between solitude and relationship. And in solitude, we are not just alone, physically alone. We all have need for our own space psychologically. Some people like to spend more time alone than others, and some people are loners, and some people are so gregarious that they can't be on their own for more than a few minutes. But so psychologically, there's a need there for different people. But the aloneness that we're talking about here, the solitude we're talking about here, is not just about being physically alone or withdrawn. It's really about plunging deep into your own identity, penetrating to the core of your self, and discovering and embracing your uniqueness. And the deeper we go, the more we become awake to that uniqueness. So the more we become our true selves, the more we are able to withdraw projections that we put onto others and free ourselves from the projections that people put onto us. The more you can therefore be yourself, And the more you are yourself, better relationships you make. The more you can relate to another person directly, without playing games, without projections, without unreal demands or expectations. So, there are many less disappointments in human relationships if you have done this work on yourself. You have found the way of being yourself and accepting yourself. And you are, what we find, of course, is the deeper we go, and it's the stillness and the silence and the simplicity of meditation that bring us down into this depth or center. The deeper you go, the more you discover your own unique identity, which at times along the journey may be frightening, because at first sight this uniqueness may seem like a terrible cosmic isolation. You know, there's a great scene in the film Mission to Mars, where the astronauts are all outside the spaceship trying to fix the damage, and one of them has to sacrifice himself because he's run out of oxygen, and he disconnects from the others and he just goes floating off into space. And it's a very graphic image of that sense of isolation, which I think many meditators have glimpsed. And some people have glimpsed it and then really taken fright. Not everybody does. You can get through it without maybe going through that momentary shock. Perhaps most people do. But if you do glimpse it, it can be a little frightening, because it seems for a second, especially I think if you have lived a very superficial kind of life. I remember a young woman, student, once saying to me that her meditation, she hadn't been doing a lot of meditation, but her meditation had triggered something in her that she had never been aware of before, and she couldn't understand it or make sense of it, but she knew that it was real. And I said, what do you think it is? And she said, well, the only thing I can describe it as is an inner life. I just never thought, I never realized I had this inner life before. And that was the way she was trying to describe it. And she was a very intelligent, well-educated young woman who had got to the age of, I don't know what, early 20s, without ever experiencing this inner world, this interiority. She lived a life totally, I suppose, you know, like many people do, totally outward motivated, achieving goals and objectives set by society or environment, and had never awakened to this, to the inside of herself. So I think the deeper we go, the more we discover this uniqueness. At first it may be a little scary because we seem not to have the company, the support, the bustle, the noise of our familiar world. But if we are not frightened off by that, very quickly we realize that this is not anything to be frightened of, it's actually the great treasure we're looking for. Because this solitude is the basis of the communion and the love and the friendship, the wholeness that we are seeking. So anyway, this maybe explains the paradox of Jesus going off alone in the company of his disciples. And he goes with a small group because perhaps there aren't that many with whom we can share this experience of ourselves. And meditation groups tend to be quite small in numbers. You know, actually I'm hearing more and more about larger meditation groups, but generally speaking, meditation groups meeting on a regular basis can be quite small. People often say to me, we have a group, but it's very small. And the but always disappoints me, because it seems to me they haven't understood that of course it's small. Of course it's going to be small. But if it gets to 8, 9 or 10 people, then it probably is time for it to split and seed itself and start another group. Anyway, so the contemplative experience seems to be best nurtured in small communities rather than in big, institutions. So he goes away with a few people that he can deeply trust. He goes into solitude in community. And he's going, in this story, to a even deeper, or penetrating some part of himself that he had not visited before. And it's a time of anguish and dismay. In the Gospel of Mark, it is described as horror and dismay. And it comes over him, is the translation, one translation. So he goes away with with his 3 close disciples. He then goes a few feet away from them to pray alone, and then this fear, horror and dismay at what is happening and what is going to happen overwhelms him. Doesn't actually describe in detail what his fear is, but it's not difficult to imagine. There is first of all the imminent fear of death. That's different from our sitting here, all of us relatively healthy probably, and saying, we're all going to die one day. Yes, but we're going to have a cup of coffee first. To realizing that in fact the time has come. It's a very different perception of death. So this is what he's feeling, and it overwhelms him. There are moments when our emotions, our anxieties, can no longer be held in check, can no longer be suppressed, and they just release themselves, or have to be released. And when that happens, we're flooded. There's a flooding of the emotional life that takes place. And much of the time we try to avoid this, because we don't want to be out of control. We don't want to be flooded by these, especially these frightening or painful or horrific feelings. So we do a lot to suppress them, keep them repressed. But at times they need to be, or have to be, released. And even though at the time we feel swept away by this tsunami of emotion, at the same time we begin to feel a kind of relief and release. Release always brings with it a feeling of relief. But that's not to say we're not swept hither and thither. We're not tossed on the waves of this storm. Much of the time we try to keep these deeper fears at bay by distraction. And we can distract ourselves, we can repress these fears in many different ways. Hyperactivity, or by drugs, or by too much religion, or too much sex, or too much work. It's very easy for us to find ways to keep ourselves insulated from these forces within us. Anyway, but when we meditate, we have to face them. It doesn't mean to say we're going to be overwhelmed like the Garden of Gethsemane every time we meditate, but it does mean that we are committing ourselves to a free flow of emotion. That we're not bottling up and disguising our emotions, but we find ourselves, as a result of this deeper inner journey, we find ourselves much more able to express our true feelings healthily, naturally, spontaneously, and yet at the same time with a certain control. So we're not, you see, if it's all bottled up, when it comes out, it's going to come out probably in a way that's unpleasant or uncontrollable to ourselves or to the unfortunate bystanders we are with at the time. But if we are continuously doing this inner work and lifting the forces of repression, then it comes out in a more controlled way. It's not just, it doesn't just come pouring out, it's something we can identify, work with, we learn how to control it without repressing it. Sometimes we have to control our feelings and suppress our feelings. We don't want to force our feelings on everybody. But that's very different from pushing it under the carpet or into unconscious repression.